free. The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free.
Hello, and welcome to the Tech Dirt Podcast. I'm Mike Masnick. It's been great to hear from some of you with your feedback on the podcast, and please continue to send that in or to discuss it on Tech Dirt Posts or via SoundCloud or iTunes or however you happen to listen to the podcast. In looking over our stats, we actually saw that at least someone, seems to be listening to this on a Zune. Who the hell are you, and why do you have a Zune? Please let us know, because that's just weird. Anyway, today we're going to be discussing cybersecurity, and if we had any sound effect capabilities, I would have made that all scary sounding. Cybersecurity has become a big buzzword in DC over the past few years, and there's been a push to pass some sort of cybersecurity legislation. Most of the focus has been on information sharing. That's the idea. The various bills that have been proposed, with the key feature being setting things up so that companies, mainly tech companies, can share threat information with government agencies and with each other to be better prepared for the various threats that are out there. No one denies that there are, in fact, huge risks online today, with lots of people around the globe looking to crack into vulnerable systems. The nature and type of these threats certainly varies. It's one thing to take down a power grid or cause a nuclear power plant to malfunction in dangerous ways. It's another to take all the emails from a major Hollywood motion picture studio. Unfortunately, those pushing for cybersecurity legislation like to conflate all of these things as if they're one big threat, never wanting to assess the real risks or the likely scenarios. We're told that we need to protect ourselves before we have a cyber Pearl Harbor, but then are told that the Sony hack was the worst cybersecurity attack in history, an attack in which no one died, and the most trouble was really some rich Hollywood insiders getting kind of embarrassed. This lack of specificity is a big concern, but an even bigger concern is that no one who is pushing for these legislative proposals seems willing to indicate what specific problems these bills are fixing. They just yell, cybersecurity, and leave it at that. If there are current regulations that are blocking the useful sharing of information, let's look at fixing those rather than just giving blanket immunity in a way that may allow more companies to share our private info with the government. The other aspect that is rarely talked about with cybersecurity is how much of the hype around it is really a giant bureaucratic turf war over who gets to control the purse strings for a massive and growing government budget. Much of the behind-the-scenes fight has really been about whether or not the Defense Department, Homeland Security, or the Justice Department will get to manage cybersecurity. Many companies seem to be pushing their support for programs that just line themselves up to be the beneficiaries of massive government cybersecurity spending, rather than on what makes the most sense overall to protect us. Given all of that, I'm skeptical that we need some special cybersecurity regulations and don't see how they do much other than create a giant government boondoggle for shoveling bags of cash to private contractors while doing little to protect our actual online security. At the same time, however, I do recognize that online attacks are growing, more and more sophisticated, and that there are real threats out there. Is the answer a new law, better security practices, or just a better understanding of the real risks and trade-offs? Here to discuss, once again, Dennis Yang and Hirsch Reddy.
Hey, guys.
Hey.
Oh, man. Every single time you hear a whole bunch of people in the military, in the press, and this kind of unholy alliance raising a disproportionate amount of fuss about something that's really not that dangerous.
Yeah.
If you just trace it back a little bit, you'll see that, wow, there's a whole lot of special interests back there just waiting for the money faucet to be opened.
And it's true. If you look
absurd.
back, right? I mean, so the whole focus on cybersecurity really started with Michael McConnell, who was a former NSA director, who was going all over the place talking about cyber war and cybersecurity, and he was on like every news channel, and this was about 5 or 6 years ago, and what none of them mentioned was that his day job after leaving the government was for Booz Allen, which is the giant government contractor, which, you know, soon after he started speaking about this stuff, got some sort of like $1 billion, I think it was maybe $800 million cybersecurity contract.
Absurd. Of which delivered by some San Francisco startup, it would cost 1/10 that, right? Like they're always absurd. Like and the things they actually deliver are absurd. But
I mean, fear is really good business, right? Like
in some circles, sure.
I mean, so here's the thing. Let's talk about the real dangers. There's definitely real dangers, right? So what are the things that are actually credible threats? There's people stealing intellectual property by hacking into corporate networks, sometimes government networks. There's people essentially stealing financial information. Sometimes, I mean, not just records, but also accessing people's bank accounts and perpetrating fraud. And then on top of that, there's like this sort of blackmail kind of an activity that centers around essentially using some kind of distributed denial of service sort of an attack and saying, hey, we're going to push down your commercial services. Like if you have a video streaming site, they'll say, we'll hit you with a bunch of co-opted machines, and we'll bring your site down unless you pay us $50,000. So there's that kind of activity. On top of that, what else do we have? I mean, along those lines, you also have a big thing that's become popular now is where malicious hackers will get into a computer, get your data, and then encrypt it, and then force you to pay to unencrypt it. But and then the bigger threats are towards real infrastructure. So could you hack into the power grid and take California off the power grid? Is that really a cybersecurity issue, or is that more sort of like a bad engineering issue? There should be air gaps for those kind of things, right?
Yes.
You should have an air gap. And for the audience, by the way, an air gap is basically where you have a computing system that is not connected to the internet, essentially, right? Or it's only occasionally.
So the argument there is that the real issue for those things are in the design of the system, not the incoming threat itself. But at the same time, right, there are examples of using computer attacks to cause real world physical damage. The problem is, well, depending on where you're sitting, the examples of that tend to have been done by the U.S. government, not against us. I mean, the Stuxnet example was, where they were able to get some malware into, an Iranian nuclear processing plant and basically, force it to accidentally blow up the machinery or cause the machinery to spin out of control and break.
So there are. So I think so. The Stuxnet virus is like a good example. There are vulnerabilities in computing systems, and you have to guard against them. And it takes real engineering work to get that done. I really doubt that Booz Allen is I'm not going to say that. I mean, but you know what I mean? Like a bunch of guys with PowerPoint in suits. Those are absolutely the wrong guys. There's like very smart engineers. Some of them are in Silicon Valley. Some of them are on IBM's campus in different places. There's people that know how to engineer, resilient systems. I mean, probably no system is 100%.
But don't those customers exist without the government having to mandate these things?
Right. Exactly. There's an economic loss associated with the hack.
Why does the government need to be involved?
Well, this is
to create these projects.
To create billion-dollar contracts. That's why.
Well, I mean, these projects, if there's a real security risk and there's, real hackers out there, I mean, security seems to be a booming business right now anyway, without the government being involved.
But so there are a couple different arguments there. And one is just this idea that, a lot of companies don't take security that seriously, right? I mean, so some of them do, but most of them recognize that if they're hacked and if their accounts are compromised, what do? They pay for 1 year of credit monitoring,
and
they issue an apology and they get on with their lives. And so the cost of that is what they judge, cost benefit versus the cost.
I mean, I would argue
they
value security exactly the amount that they think, right?
Sure.
Right.
But the government's argument is that the real risk is much higher than that cost. And so there's a misalignment between the costs and the risks are going to be borne by the citizens, not necessarily the companies that are responsible, and therefore that's a position where the government should step in.
Well, there's different people who could step in there, right? So the government could step in terms of actually having these worthless contracts, or they could step in by essentially putting in rules of the road that basically say, hey, look, in this kind of a hacking situation, you bear this sort of liability. And then the companies that could possibly bear that liability will get specifically security insurance. And
Right.
those insurance companies will then audit these companies and make sure they
Right.
have at least a level of security that they're comfortable with. And then a family of companies, I should say an ecosystem of companies will spring up to provide these security services. And that's the way stuff
Yeah.
has gone on in the technological industry, and that's the way things should be. But here's the issue, right? The real issue is doing it that way actually the insurance companies are incentivized to identify the real risks, not these like black swan event things that like
Right.
barely ever happen.
Yeah.
You don't need to optimize for that, right? Like the government, it's been shown time and time again, they love security theater, right? Like what the TSA does, and they're not really that concerned about it actually being economically efficient,
Right.
right?
And which is a really good point. And
Yeah.
that point is that there's always going to be some risk, right? No matter what you do, you can't protect 100% against everything. And yet all of these proposals seem to be focused on this idea that we can never be hit, right? But we're going to be. And so, but because they focus on this sort of 100% protection, there's no cost benefit analysis of how much is this security.
So does this wash out to become more like an insurance type, like a mandated auto insurance type thing?
I mean, ideally, but that's not how it's going to work.
No, that's not how it's going to work. I mean, I think Hirsch is right. Where if you properly place the liability on the parties who are most responsible for it,
Right.
then you actually get a marketplace that potentially works
Yeah.
because
so
the insurance
you put the incentives and the risks in the right place.
But that's not what's being proposed at all.
I see.
But let's look at the hypocrisy here, right? On the one hand, the government says, "Hey, we have all these cybersecurity risks, and someone could hack into our system." And then on the other hand, they say, "Hey, please put in these back doors
Yeah.
so that we can
That's the other
look at
side of it.
How
Right.
are you supposed to make a secure system as an engineer if the government says, "Hey, we'd like us a little key, so we can read all the hard drive information"? Hi, like you can't do it. Like it just doesn't work that way. And if you really want to talk to engineers, right, in Silicon Valley, they'll say, if you want a secure system, right, the real way, like a public system, right, like let's say we want a very secure web stack that allows you to authenticate, it keeps data safe, it prevents session hijacking, those kinds of things. They'll say, hey, let's make a public stack, make it open source, let a lot of people hammer on it, and then give bounties. So when people hack it, they have an incentive. Hey, you get paid $100,000, and the government, if they want, they can pay for those bounties. That'll be great. And then we'll evolve this like secure infrastructure in the open without requiring, by the way, all these insiders to get, and these lobbyists to get so much money that they build mansions on the Potomac, right? It's like, which is essentially what this is all boiling out to, right? Like when you say some high-leveled agency guy is going to go to some private agency, to some private consulting company, and then get them $1 billion contract for some completely inexplicable.
Well, because people want
thing.
it. Like when you sign up for a contract, you want to hear, oh, how much is it going to cost to build me a 100% secure system? And you're like, all right, $1 trillion. You're like, that sounds sufficiently expensive. Awesome, sign me up. Right?
Have you ever talked to anyone working in these kind of consulting companies or for any of these government contracts that hasn't come back from the experience and said, we built the most absurd, just gobbledygook thing of patchwork, and thank God it passed the requirements test. But my God, I would not want to be the next guy to do anything with it. Like it's always the case. It's like, how is that secure?
Well, government computing systems are just notoriously boondoggle mess.
Right.
But all right, so let me throw in one more argument here,
Mm-hmm.
somewhat playing devil's advocate, because I think I agree with you, Hirsch, on almost all that. I vote for your proposal, but so one other argument is that the government. And potentially the NSA certainly makes this argument that they have knowledge and information about threats at a higher level than a private company might have. And therefore, by working together with the NSA or perhaps some other government agencies, they can better protect because they know more about these things.
That's actually a good point. But that's a different sort of level of operation. Certainly, like there's a private company, Cloudflare, that does the same thing. So we were talking about distributed denial of service attacks. Cloudflare can help mitigate those kinds of things because they support so many customers. They know who the usual suspects are in terms of these IP ranges or whatever, and they can block them or rate limit them and prevent them from bringing your website down. They basically stand between you and the open internet.
Right.
So there is a place, I think, for entities like that aggregate information and then therefore are able to do sort of better, higher level analysis to figure out who the bad players are. But that doesn't involve secrecy or billion-dollar contracts. That information sharing, perhaps I think the best thing the government can do there is pass the laws necessary so that sharing of the information is not forbidden by law explicitly. Because sometimes revealing that kind of information might be.
So currently, that is the argument that is going on right now, which is that the proposed laws, and it gets a little bit fine line. The proposed laws right now basically take away liability or grant immunity to companies for sharing that kind of information.
For sharing potential threats and
for sharing cybersecurity threat information.
Right.
So what's your beef with that?
So my beef with that is that I would prefer what you actually said before, which is if there is a specific law that is currently preventing that information from being shared, let's address that law. Let's not put in another law that is a blanket immunity from liability for sharing information.
Yeah, that is shenanigans once again. Because then there's not even a cybersecurity threat, and they're like, hey, I'd like Michael Masnick's whereabouts for the last 24 hours. And it's like, okay. I guess a blanket immunity for doing that. That's not
and that's why certainly, the tech industry, for the most part, they haven't come out strongly against this bill because it's like, well, wait, that's great. That gives us blanket immunity, right? So even if they're saying they don't want to share that information, they won't share that information. A lot of the bills actually are pretty clear that this is voluntary sharing of information. But if they have blanket immunity, they're certainly a lot more likely to share it and not think about the potential legal consequences of sharing information.
There's a court of law, but then there's a court of public opinion, right?
Sure.
So I mean,
but you know how much of this is done in secret,
yeah,
right? I mean, sure, it
exactly,
might leak out eventually, but
yeah.
Until then. So let me bring up one more cybersecurity issue, and then I think we're gonna wrap this one up. But on one of the issues that's come up is whether or not there should be hackback provision. So if a company's network is being attacked or the computers are being hacked, or if there's a denial of service attack, should they have the right or the ability to then go back to the source and try and knock out the master computer that's controlling the denial of service attack on them?
Yeah. Is that currently? I mean, what's the current law about that? Right?
That is currently against the law for the most part.
So if you hack me, I can't hack you.
Yeah, for the most part, because the hacking back would violate the CFAA, which because you're hacking into a computer.
There's no self-defense corollary or anything to
that's
provision.
No, there's not, and there's some push to get one.
But the problem with that is that the intermediary that's used to actually launch the attack is sometimes an innocent party.
You get to the heart of the problem, or you mislead and you make people think that it's coming from someone else,
and that gets really
you set up two companies that you dislike and you hack one and make it look like it's coming from the other, and then you let them hack at each other.
Right.
Obviously there's that downside. What's the upside? See, the upside is basically that. What? I mean, exactly. Does that help mitigate an attack if you attack back?
Right.
I'm not quite sure that's true.
Is that the only solution? It's not the only solution.
No, it's not the only solution. But the argument there is that if it's like a denial of service attack, right? If you can take out the controlling bot that's controlling the denial of service attack, then you get your site back, right?
Right.
Yeah, that actually, I might be behind that. That's one machine. It's kind of like collateral damage, maybe.
Well, but but you have to know, is that the real machine? And the amount of collateral damage could be pretty serious. I mean, what if you're taking out something else that's really important?
Yeah, it's complicated.
And what if you just start escalating it, right? Then once you hack back, then it just becomes a big fight back and forth. And
presumably you're already under attack. So it's not like those guys were holding anything back.
I guess, but
so here's the thing, right? Like I think the nightmare scenario there is actually not the single old lady's computer, Windows 95 machine being taken down, because that actually happens to be the control IP. I think the nightmare scenario is where someone is running a virtual machine, let's say Amazon Web Services or something like that, and that's where the control instance is, and then a state agency or a state entity attacks Amazon Web Services, right? And then there's huge economic loss for some other reason. But I actually think in that kind of a situation, that information sharing that we talked about is like once someone finds out what the range of IP addresses is, they can do, maybe you put into the legislation that they have to do a certain amount of due diligence and find out who is this and contact the the person responsible for that range of IPs and then see what they can do. Because then AWS or Google Cloud or whatever will jump in and be like, oh, that range of IPs, let's see. Ooh, this virtual machine, well, it's supposed to be owned by Mike Masnick. He really is probably not a hacker. This is probably, of course, then they contact you and then they say, hey, by the way, this is coming from your machine. And then you look and you see that you share your access keys or something on GitHub. And then they basically...
You've got this scenario very detailed.
Hypothetically.
That happens so often, by the way. Some people write scripts that scrape GitHub, get all the keys that people accidentally uploaded, and then go ahead and mine Bitcoins or whatever they want to do.
Yeah, which is not great business. But
all right, so
really
that's
not.
a different podcast for a different day.
Yeah.
So let's do some final thoughts in terms of the cybersecurity. How big of a problem is it really, and is there a role for government here or not? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, if it's strictly to support this, military industrial complex, it seems like a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
The facade of a 100% protected system is, it's not achievable. And I think Hirsch brought up really good points about like the reality of designing systems, and openness is much better than a closed system that you think is completely secure, because it's not, right?
So obviously those points, and then on top of that, I mean, I'd really like to see for something like cybersecurity that very much Silicon Valley has the expertise about it. I'd really like to see some of these players being Silicon Valley companies.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to involve Amazon and Google and stuff like that, and really not another East Coast insider consultancy. Like, you know what I mean?
Your bias is showing.
No, well, I mean, come on. We actually deliver stuff here on this side of the country, you know what I mean? As opposed to just consuming huge contracts. Am I going to get you in trouble?
I was going to say, we just lost half our listenership at the east of the Mississippi.
That's fine. I'm not saying they're all like that. I mean, IBM does great work. But what I'm saying is, like, I mean, so... Come on, all right, I'm just going to keep quiet now.
Oh, that's great. No, but so my final thought is actually to reinforce the idea that you brought up earlier, which is I do really like the idea of if you could do it wisely, and I would have to think through what the consequences of this would be, of placing the liability properly on those who fail to secure their systems completely, that you would set up an insurance system that actually would lead to greater security. I worry a little bit about some of the consequences of that, and the fact that, again, no system is perfectly unhackable and people are going to get hacked sooner or later. And do we necessarily want to put an overburdensome liability on those companies? That may be a risk, but again, maybe that's taken care of by the insurance aspect to it. But overall, I mean, I think that kind of approach is a lot more interesting than anything that the government is currently talking about in terms of cybersecurity.
Well, certainly the penalties should be proportional, right?
Sure.
I think there's a lot of punitive legislation out there where the penalties are just disproportionate.
Yeah.
So you should look at what the kind of information is and what the possible loss could be. So financial information, obviously the highest. Right?
Sure.
And then maybe potentially embarrassing personal details, maybe second to that. And then
yes, but that raises a whole bunch of other issues.
Yeah, okay. Let's not jump into that. But loss of, say, for example, your post history on like Reddit or something like that. I mean, that's maybe, actually depending on what you posted on Reddit, that
suddenly it changes. So I mean, I think what it comes down to is what Dennis said earlier, which is just if you align the incentives properly,
right,
you get better results. And so I think that's what the focus should be. Unfortunately, that's not quite where it is today. But we can always hope, and we're nothing if not hopeful here at Tech Dirt. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Hirsch and Dennis, for another fun podcast, and we hope you enjoyed listening.
It's been said that the first casualty of war is truth, and I'm inclined to agree. Listen, we live in an age of instant information, so isn't it strange that things have been hidden away from us? Governments think we need to gain their trust, but it's the other way around. Just take a look. Nothing tells us more than raw data does, so it's important it's all available to us. Plus, put up for debate and looked at by the public's gaze, because there's a lot more to be gained from taking off the